Welcome to season 2 of Our Culture to the World. I'm Melva Persico. Come with me and meet new people and share their experiences. In today's episode, today we begin our second season of Our Culture to the World, and I've invited 3 ladies that I've known for most of my life. We were all from the bauxite mining town of Linden in Guyana, and we went to school together, and now we find ourselves here in the United States. And what we'll be doing today is sharing how our move from Guyana to the United States has impacted us. So ladies, please introduce yourselves to the viewers.
Okay, my name is Patricia Mitchell, but most of my friends know me as Patty Mitchell. I grew up in Linden. I was born there, I grew up there, and I lived there until I left in 1984 to come to the US. Like many of my friends, I ended up in New York. And I stayed there until 9/11 when work just disappeared because I worked in the IT industry and my company supported some of the companies that were on Wall Street. And when those towers fell, the jobs disappeared with that tragedy. And it took me a while to leave New York. My friends would tell me, there's work in Washington, D.C., you should come. And I said, no, I'm not going, I'm from New York. But eventually I was forced to leave. So I moved to Washington, D.C. in 2004. And I've lived here ever since. I love Washington, D.C. Of all the places I've lived, I enjoy Washington, D.C. best. And I know I'll be here for the long run.
Okay. Welcome, Patty. So who's next?
I'm going to jump in. My name is Paula Walcott Quintin, and unlike Patty, I ain't got no call name. I'm Paula, or maybe P to so many of my friends, P Wally to some others. I'm from Half Mile, Wismar, and I actually left the same year as Pat. Pat, myself, and Althea and Melva, we're all from the same school. So we have this real organic connection that spans, 40, 50 years, actually. And Pat left earlier in 84, and I remember distinctly leaving on the day in which her younger sister and father were traveling to the US, unknown to me. So we all met up at the airport, and guess who was there to see us off? Althea Casey.
Oh.
September of 84. So I came to the US in September 84 and have always lived in New Jersey. I spent one night in New York because I came in late, very late, and a friend picked me up. So I've been blessed, I suppose, or maybe constrained by being in one state for the duration of my time here, which is approaching 40 years. I work in media and communications, and I work at Rutgers University, which is, I attended there for my undergraduate, and I did get a degree in journalism to augment my work in the field when I was in Guyana. A wonderful job on the radio. It was the best job I would tell people I ever had. I started at the top in many ways because it really has formed who I am. And it encouraged me to have a degree in journalism, which I did from Rutgers. And I stayed at Rutgers. So I'm currently employed there as a communications specialist. And I absolutely enjoy it.
Okay, thank you, Paula. Althea, you're up next.
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much, Barbara, for this wonderful opportunity. My name is Althea Casey, and I do have many nicknames, which I will not share at this forum. But as Paul and Patty have said, we are all former classmates. Fortunately for me, I'm from the best part of Guyana, a place called Sisters Village, East Bank Province. I have been an educator. I've been an educator all of my adult life, starting at the Wismar Hill Primary School, where I attended my first alma mater. And it has brought me, that experience has taught me and has brought me to the United States of America, where I've worked as an educator in New York, in Huntsville, Alabama, in San Antonio, Texas. And so it seems as though teaching is my calling. And in the process, I continue to learn about myself, about my fellow man, about my community. And in that process as well, I try to be the best version of myself to others. So Melva, I hope this opportunity affords me a space where I can share something and learn something as I continue to educate myself and others.
Oh, I'm sure it will. I'm sure. And when you talk about, I didn't even realize that you weren't born in Linden, Althea. So you're from East Barbary. Yeah, but when you talk about Half Mile, Paula, I remember you and Donna stopping.
Yes.
You got to pass us.
To go
We
to the
stopped to go to Sunday school and primary school. And Althea was my classmate from standard 1 to standard 3.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Yes.
right. That's right.
And
We go way-
and then when we moved to Mackenzie, then is when I met Patty and her family. And so, we have a long history, and it's so good to be with you, ladies. Yes, Patty, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to circle back. I forgot to tell you what work I do. I do work. So I've worked in IT, information technology, for almost 40 years, which totally dates me, but yes, that's what I've done. And I used to work as an applications developer for many, many years, but the last 7 years or so, I've been working in project management. And I currently work as a federal contractor for an armed forces university called Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Is a big mouthful.
Mhm,
This is
mhm.
what we do. We educate the military folk in medicine, nursing, allied health professions, and dentistry, and just about everybody from the different arms of the armed forces. They come here for further education, and I work in the business processes group where we try to develop requirements and processes that support the system and software products that are needed by the school.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Patty. So thank you all for introducing yourselves. And now, Linden, and then now here we are in the US, in different states. And when you first moved here, well, you said which years you came. I'm the baby of the group in terms of when I came, because I came first in 91, just for 2 years. And then I went back home, and then, I would visit vacation from time to time, but really to stay, it was in 2005. So, I'm the one who came last. But when you first moved to the US, what were your first impressions of the country, the culture?
Okay. When I first came, I was really shocked at how different America looked in different areas. Like, you'd find well manicured lawns and beautiful homes in some areas, and then you'll find, neighborhoods that are not well maintained. And that was surprising to me, because my assumption 40 years ago was that you come into this place where everything is on point and everything is being done well. But the longer you live here, you realize that a lot of the services that are available to different areas kind of match the demographics and the income levels that are there. So that for me was a bit surprising. Another thing that was surprising to me is that I assumed that as a Black person, I would seamlessly assimilate into American society. But I soon came to understand that within our communities, there's a vision about where you're from and how you got to where you got to. And one thing that was particularly shocking to me was something that happened pretty recently when Kamala Harris started running for president. I was at a friend's home, and all of a sudden she says, "Well, I don't know why Kamala is running, because she really is not African American." I'm like, what is that all about? She was born in America, wasn't she? And she proceeded to explain to me that in Black communities, an African American is defined as a person who could trace their lineage back to slavery. And I said to her, "But if we step out on the street, somebody looks at the color of my skin, nobody knows whether I have ancestors who were slaves. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, I'm a Black person."
Mhm.
But she was very adamant. She said, "No, you are Black, yes, but you're not African American." And what I came to find out is that there's an organization called the American Descendants of Slavery.
Mhm.
It's a foundation where they seriously try to protect their interests. And I think a lot of it had to do with this promise that the government made that they were going to give them the 40
Reparations.
acres and a mule.
Mhm.
And I think what they're trying to do is to have, if that ever comes to pass, that that symbol of reparation
Mhm.
is not spread across the entire African American community, because we didn't have that experience, and they feel it is their right that if their ancestors were part of the slavery experience, that they shouldn't share that whatever form of reparation
Mhm.
comes to them with people who had not actually been part of the experience.
Of the
And
experience, but no, sorry.
yeah,
Mhm. I
that was
understand.
pretty shocking to me.
Mhm.
I've come to kind of understand it a little better, but because when I turned to my friend and said, "Explain to me what you're saying," she couldn't effectively explain to me that it had to do with their need to protect what they saw as their born their right to
Mhm.
whatever reparations were given to ancestors of slavery.
And the thing is, we are ancestors of people who were enslaved as well, but not in this country. And
Right.
the
I
same
couldn't
as
accept
Kamala
the argument.
Harris, because her father is Jamaican. So, but I when you explain that, I understand what
They
they.
totally reject that argument, Melvin, because the lady I was talking to, actually, her father is Jamaican, but her mother was born in the US, and they do have ancestors who were slaves. What she said to me is that both of Kamala's parents are foreigners. So even though she was born here, she's not technically an African American. And I'll wrap up in a few in a few seconds. I think while I understand their experience, it encourages division among Black people across America, because there are these little groups here and groups here that have their own special interests, and I think it just divides us.
Mhm.
But you cannot deny the argument that they have that if reparations are to come, it's theirs exclusively and they shouldn't have to share it.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. All right. Paula, what about you? How
Yeah,
or
what Patty
Althea?
what Patty described is just shows the level of intricacy, in all of our cultural and political and social lives here, and how intertwined things are. But even as we are ostensibly alike, there's certain schisms and divisions that unfortunately are really wrapped up in so many things, and it'll be hard to unpack that, but to your question about first experiences, as I mentioned, because I came in at night, one of I would say the first and really an enduring recollection is just the lights, the brightness. I mean, it sounds like a trivial thing, but it really was my very first interaction, is coming through the airport. You fly in and you just see New York lit up. Now, coming from South America, Guyana, here we all are, we do have, the developed center of the town and the city, Georgetown, but much of it, you're able to really see the stars because we don't have that same light intensity. So you're able to step out and still enjoy the view of the sky and the moonlight and all that. And what I felt was all of this intoxicating light. It just felt like an assault on the eyes, very eye-opening. So that really was my very, very first impression. And of course, the vastness, because to come into the center of New York and then drive for what seemed like an inordinately long time from New York to where my mother had settled in the middle of New Jersey, just underscored for me, my first impression, just how big this place really is,
And Althea?
Yeah, listening to Patty and Paula talk about the different, Bob Morley also talked about the different schisms that, we have experienced and continue to experience. But one of the things that particularly struck me in my early days of coming to the United States of America, especially being in New York, I was particularly impressed, and I still am. It has been and continues to be very impactful and beneficial to me. It relates to how candidly Americans speak on television about their intimate relationships, about sex, about diseases, such as cancer. It really startled me, impressed me, surprised me, because doing that kind of thing, having those conversations in Guyana is taboo, as we know, and so I found it liberating. At home, if somebody has cancer, I recall hearing my mom say, "Oh my, Miss Jane's got the C." She wouldn't say the word cancer. Yeah, the big C. Thank you for that. The big C. And so I thought to myself, wow, if someone did say the word cancer, maybe it was an ill omen, or perhaps it was a death sentence, for that particular person. And so experiencing daytime talk show, listening to someone like Oprah Winfrey and Phil Donahue, and I know I'm dating myself when I say these names, but the fact that folks can get on television and speak so eloquently about their lives, intimate or otherwise, says to me how disadvantaged we were, because had we those experiences, we would have been better holistically as individuals and as communities. So for me, that was one of the cultural impacts that I benefited from, that I learned from, and still continue to learn from.
Okay, yes. But I mean, I listened to you, and all those things are, things that were, I found impactful as well. One of the things though, and I think it's kind of related to some of what you said before, but I'm still gonna see if we could open this up a little more. In coming to the US from Guyana in the 80s or the 90s or whenever, we would have come with certain illusions about what life was in the US. And then when we got here, we were kind of, we got a little culture shock. For instance, I remember when Patty, you mentioned about the different neighborhoods. I remember one of the things that struck me when I came in 91, first like driving down, the flight came in like midday, driving down from JFK to Brooklyn. And I was like, by that time, Guyana, we had TV in Guyana. So, I'm seeing, I'm looking for all these, the buildings that you would see in Manhattan, and I'm not seeing them. And I'm seeing people like pushing their laundry carts on the street and with, not well dressed, and, because I had this vision of the States from TV.
Right.
And and that wasn't the reality that I mean, it like, again, it might sound like something trivial, but then it's something that, when you come for the first time, it hits you. But what about you? Any other kinds of illusions that you had that that maybe you didn't mention before, that were when you actually
Mel,
got here?
Mel, when I was laughing a little bit when you you're talking about the idea of what you saw, as they say, in real time, right? Or in real life, IRL, differed vastly from what you saw on television. Now, a little bit of that is my wheelhouse, not TV, but in the whole art of communicating, right? And you begin to understand that it behooves you to really be a better consumer of news and process information and seek things out for yourself, because you can be sold a bill of goods, right?
Right, to the media.
Sold a view just by some clever editing. And if you were to get serious for a moment, you can be sold news and information that, due to clever editing, even photoshopping, that's untrue, it's salacious, it is just downright corrupt and fraudulent. So I mean, it's going down that road to a darker thing, but even when not intended, so there's light and dark at play all the time in the media, in just some of the shows that they're fiction, right? And you get a sense of a place many times through cultural vehicles, books, because we read a lot. We grew up at a time when we didn't have TV. So we read a lot, and quite frankly, we all had this romantic notion of much of the English countryside and all of that, because we're all Anglophiles, right? We grew up on many of these British authors. And so we even had our own ideas about life, love, travel, romance, just all kinds of things based on what was projected through many times fictionalized version by a very clever writer. So TV is the ultimate visual element that really can sell you. And you enjoy it when it's obviously a movie, when you know it's a movie. That's clever. But when it's real life and being used to sell something fictional deliberately, that's when you get on the darker side. But I've always said, and I have children, and I say to the boys growing up and to young people, just seek information on your own, because the technology is moving so fast and people put things out there. Not everything you read on the internet is news or true. So, but as you were talking about just what was real and what you expected, which maybe we mostly learned through film, etc. It really is an interesting
illusion versus reality.
Precisely.
Sometimes trying to say.
Yes. All right. Anybody else wanted to jump in on that idea of any culture shock experience or so?
Well, for me, the culture shock was the different seasons. Back home in Guyana, you think, oh, winter must be something fancy. You see pictures again, the illusions, and there's this white snow, and it looks so pretty. And then you turn up in America. I came January 14th, 1984. It was one of the coldest nights. As we live here, we understand the snow could fall and it could melt and it could dry, and no more snow could fall on top of it. Well, that's what happened the night I arrived in the U.S. And I remember feeling so incredibly cold. I thought I was never going to thaw out ever again. It was so incredibly cold. And, on the way home, my aunt had the heat turned up. I'm sitting with this winter coat, shivering and shivering. I got home. They ran a bath and had me sit in it for a minute because I was so cold. And now I come to realize that, now that I've lived here for a long time and I've seen many, many winters, it wasn't as cold as I thought it was. It was all relative to my experience. And so the different seasons always fascinate me. My favorite is autumn. I think that's the best temperatures you could find across the board. But yeah, the different seasons really did fascinate me a lot.
I don't know if you guys remember, when we first, because we all came in the Northeast, so of course snow was a part of the season. I don't know about you, but you don't realize just how corny it became for everybody to have their first obligatory snow shot. You know, you put on your winter clothes and you go out there and you pose off, and then you send the pictures back to your friends. But, I mean, many times you see the sun, because during the day the sun is out and it feels really nice behind the window panes, because the sun warms it up and it feels, but you sometimes don't realize just how cold it is. And I think we've all had a bit of that experience of running outside, maybe either forgetting the coat or dressing inadequately, and you realize by the time you get to the car or by the curb, you're like, oh my goodness. So it's that shocking sense of the seasons, because Guyana is warm, even though it has different seasons, rainy, dry, and all of that. It is
rain
really
and
warm.
sun, rain or sun.
It's warm, but it's also warm, you know. So that cold did take some adjusting, and like Patty, autumn is my favorite. You know, we've lived longer here. In my case, and Pat's and Althea's probably longer here than we have in Guyana. So in fact, we've become quite used to the more temperate climes. So going back home to Guyana, unless I am in front of the fan or the air conditioning, I tell you, I wilt in the South American sun.
Okay. Let's talk about aspects of U.S. life that we feel, or life and culture that have had the biggest impact on us. What would you say? Who wants to go first? Althea, you want to go first on that?
So I thought of, as someone who has been in academia all of my professional life, I thought of looking at this idea of the cultural impact, being in this part of the hemisphere for so long. It has had on me as a student, first of all, because I came here on a student's visa to go to school. And I was immediately confronted by the difference in the way questions were asked on exams. You know, we have come from a school, we were schooled by the Brits, and so by the British, sorry. And so the general form of questions tended to be open-ended, open questions, right? And multiple choice was not one of the popular things for us at Mackenzie High School. So coming here to America, when I went to Huntsville, Alabama, and I had my first test in accounting, and I'm looking at all of these multiple choice questions, and I'm becoming so overly analytical, right? And the answers are staring me in the face. And I'm saying it cannot be this simple. It cannot be. So for me, there was and continues to be actually a learning curve. I'm trying to deprogram myself, right, into understanding or learning, wait a minute, here's a question, the answer is right there. Try not to get so caught up in this thinking process that the answer is hidden somewhere. There's no trick in it. So it's one of those things that continues to that I continue to learn. It's no longer a challenge, but I still find it rather. It seems like a very simplistic way of learning in this country, and I use the word simplistic in quotation marks. I believe this country facilitates everyone. Everyone can potentially be successful academically, achieve academic success, as opposed to learning in the British system where you have to know the facts. You just have to be able to write eloquently, elegantly, and when you've learned something, it's there. It's very. I can still memorize my 16 times tables. I learned that as a 9-year-old in Miss Crowther's class, Melv. I don't know if you remember Miss Crowther, but we just had to study those things. So as a student, I found it, and I still find it rather interesting. I transitioned from learning that into implementing that nonetheless as a teacher when I moved on to the college level. But going back to my experience as a student in academia, one of the other things that I found particularly interesting, challenging, enthralling, all of those adjectives, is the ability to collaborate and working in groups. You know, you are required to do that. You know, whether you're a freshman, you're in grad school, whatever, it just becomes par for the course. And so, coming from a different culture, I'm a woman. I'm a Black woman. I bring my own values. I bring my own mores. I am of a different ethnicity. And so when we collaborate as groups, there are all of these elements that form our culture that we bring to the table. And so having to negotiate the pathway to collaborate into achieving a successful goal, presenting a paper. I recall the first time we were doing research and analysis in my MBA program, right? And one of the younger students, we put together a thesis statement. And so I reviewed the statement and I said, oh, so we have some editing to do. And she looked at me and she said, Althea, this doesn't have to be perfect. Well, where I'm from, we are McKenzie High School. We know, right, that we have to write correctly. And so I didn't shift. I didn't negotiate that because I figure at the end of the day, what we present is a reflection of the group, right? Mm-hmm. And so when there were stumbling blocks along the way, when shortcuts were to be made, etc., I recall not having the software application at home. And so I stayed on campus, worked by myself, pushed through. And so when I talked with the professor and I said to her, we're just having some tiny struggles here. What recommendations do you have? She said to me, Althea, when you guys step over there in corporate America, you guys have to figure it out. I thanked her and went back, did my thing. And when I presented, what I found was so, again, was beneficial for me is that we spoke individually, and as a group, I spoke as if everyone were a part of the project, but everyone wasn't. But at the end of the day, I benefited personally because it's as if I were still working on that project as we speak. And so I learned that collaborating in some environments in academia is not necessarily how you start the game, but how you end it, right? In your best interest. And so when I teach groups and work individually and collectively, so I'm able to integrate my experiences as a student in that teaching process based on what I have learned. And I'll pause there.
I guess I could piggyback on what Althea just said as well, because we used a certain method of learning coming from Guyana. And I remember when everyone was in elementary school, he'll present the paper and he'll get 100%, but I see spelling errors and grammatical errors. And I say to the teacher, how could he get 100 if the errors on the page? And she told me he understands the concept and that's what's important. And I guess, eventually they all learn, but it's certainly different from what we've been exposed to in terms of getting everything right. That spelling should be right, grammar should be right, and the concept be right. So yeah, that's a little different.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
What I did find though, let me just expand a little more. I've talked with educators within the system, and they would say things like, you might find students from another country being very, very focused on their academics, and they're getting straight A's and stuff like that. But when they come to the US, they find it very difficult to adapt the way Americans do. They operate in a very siloed kind of existence. If it's not something that they learn in school, a lot of times their initiative to stepping out and just doing things differently kind of suffers. And this educator was telling me, as much as we may think that the American system of education is a little different and probably not perfect, those students, when they get out into the world, they do have this "I'm going to do it regardless of what happens" kind of attitude, and so they're ultimately successful, even though their path is not quite the way the path that we've been used to. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, does.
You know, they talk a lot about the fact that, you know, they may try to recruit students from other countries who are academically qualified, but don't have the get up and go attitude that you find across here. And I guess a lot of it has to do with the constant push for excellence, a constant push to be the best you can be. So they go out and knock everything down trying to get what it is they're trying to do, and ultimately they're successful about it.
I guess we also just approach it perhaps differently, because all of us here on this platform do exactly that. You know what I mean? And so perhaps it cuts both ways, because we have come from a space where we essentially do what it takes to get a job. And until we get where we want to go, we keep pushing and we keep fighting and kicking and throwing the kitchen sink or whatever so that we can be successful. I think, yeah, we do that. I think we can testify to that as well.
All right.
Yeah.
Paula, I know you were going to say something.
Yeah, so I was thinking about the idea about something that was really impactful for me is the idea of how, you know, moving to America really thrust me into that space, that whole contemplation of how race, and sometimes to a lesser degree, culture, colors, pun intended, my life, my experiences, and undoubtedly, maybe in different ways, but undoubtedly everybody's experience. And I talk about the idea of race and culture in this way. Coming from a majority minority, and I hate the words, either of those words, but a majority minority place in which most people are darker skinned, right? Whether Indo-Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, or so. So coming from that kind of milieu, that kind of racial homogeneity almost, and by no means am I suggesting African and Indian are homogeneous, but are homogeneous. The idea, though, is coming to America and all of its rainbow of colors, but coming as a Black person here, the idea is I then had to navigate this majority culture, white America, and how race sort of really played into so many things, and gender. And I'm going to use this, my experiences going to college. I went to Rutgers here in my mid-20s for my undergraduate degree. And I often found myself the only person of color in the room in my honors classes, right? Now, that was, I kind of had to step back to really try to get a better understanding of it. Because over time, I came to realize how important it is to have others like yourself at the table. It brings a certain kind of comfort and a place and a sense of being. And I found that so much of my 4 years of college was influenced by many times being one of few in a larger cultural space and racial space. And I was grateful at the time that I started college at 26 and not typically, you know, coming right out of high school, 18. So I came with a little bit more maturity and maturity of years to the to my college experience, but I realized that it still impacted me greatly. And in some ways, being separated from high school for those 8 years, almost 8 years, because I started at 26, I had a sense of maybe a little bit of insecurity as to whether or not I could compete. This is America, you know, and whether I can compete. And it took me a full cycle and a full year of really applying myself and doing well, very well, to get a feeling of comfort. But it stayed with me, this sense of being one of few in this space. And Althea talking about being an educator reminds me very much about a now deceased professor who really became a mentor, white American, and who really affirmed me and my differentness in this way. She said, if with my spelling, Patty talked a little bit about that differentness. We spelled a certain way because, you know, we came from the British system. My spelling was different. And she had the foresight to not consider my spelling words like flavor and favor incorrectly. She said, keep your spelling. You plan to go back? By all means. And that small thing really validated my experience, you know, validated who I am and my differentness. And while it said I was different, it also said that there was a place for this differentness because I spoke differently. You know, I spoke differently. I grew up with a mother who was a teacher, for one. Then I also, my first real job was in radio. So speaking well was something you had to do. And even if you didn't operate in that professional space that I had the privilege to be a part of, as Pat and Althea and yourself would test, you just spoke well because that's what was expected of you. So I really had to I became more aware of the whole idea of how race and of course some of that cultural differentness really colors a lot of my interaction with other people, because clearly I looked different and I sounded different. You know?
Yes, I think I'm sure each of us had that kind of experience in one, you know, on one way or the other. One way or another, yes. You know.
That is very true. I remember I work in IT, and like Paula said, oftentimes you are one of few people who look like you in the space. Interesting thing is, I think a lot of us who come from South America, Guyana, and other Caribbean countries, we come with a confidence that I think allows us to assimilate into this culture without recognizing and interpreting slurs that have been thrown at African Americans for decades and, well, centuries. So we come with our sense of self and our confidence, and a lot of stuff go over our head. You know, like a girlfriend of mine, she said she was standing online and this guy says to her, "What you doing here? Just go to the back of the bus." And she's like, "Back of the bus?" Then she realized belatedly that it was a reference to Rosa Parks. So there's something about the socialization of the African American and our own socialization back home, because we didn't have that kind of we didn't have racism as it manifests over here when we were growing up in Guyana. And simple things like, you know, I sat next to a white guy who was in accounting, and somehow we found out what my rate was for the job, for the contract job I was doing. He says to me one day, "How do you guys come here and know all this stuff and make this kind of money?" And I looked at him and I said, "You know, where I come from, we do have schools, and most of what I learned, I came with that knowledge. I didn't learn a whole lot over here." So, you know, he looked at me like, I'm like, you know, don't be condescending. I came here with education, so you need to push back and just, you know, keep going. So yes, we have those kinds of experiences. And I think even though we have, it's not as searing as happens to African Americans who grew up under the scourge of slavery and, you know, discrimination and racism. It's a little different. Well, it's a lot different for them, and so we interpret those experiences a lot differently from how they do.
Before we move on to the next point, I just wanted to say quickly, talk a little bit about punctuality. We kind of, you know, some of the things you talked about being the only one in the class. Before I learned what it was to be invisible for the first time in my life, which I do. But something that had a big impact on me was punctuality, and I want to talk a little bit about that because, you know, if it's not like for something really, really formal or serious, you know, we had something we would say again. Oh, let's say you're invited to a social event and it's supposed to be at 7 o'clock, right? It's no big problem if you turn up at 7:30 or 7:45. And so I was kind of used to that way of being. And then when I went to live when I came in 2005, I spent 7 years in Miami. And we lived in an area of Miami that was predominantly Hispanic. So most of the people I socialized with were Latin Americans who had that same casual view of time. So, you know, somebody invited you over to their house and they said 7 o'clock is no big deal if you turn up at 7:30. So, and so when I moved to South Carolina, well, that was a culture shock to me